I was cleaning out my wallet on a Sunday afternoon, the way you do every few months when it gets too thick to sit right in your back pocket, when I found the card. Dr. Warren Michaels, LMFT, Michaels Family Counseling. Feel free to reach out between sessions if either of you needs to process something individually. He'd given us each one at our very first appointment, 8 weeks earlier, and I remembered him saying almost exactly that line as he slid the cards across his desk, one to me and one to Sarah, like a dealer finishing a hand. I hadn't thought about mine since. I was about to toss it in the junk drawer with the loyalty cards and old parking stubs when Sarah's phone lit up on the kitchen counter 8 feet away, face up, screen bright enough to catch my eye from across the room. Wendy, Pilates, same time Tuesday? I'll bring the thing we talked about. I don't know what made me do what I did next. I've turned it over 100 times since, trying to figure out what exact instinct fired in that half second, because on paper, there was nothing strange about it at all. My wife's Pilates instructor confirming a class. The most boring text message a phone has ever received. But something in me, some low hum that had been building for weeks without a name, made me walk over, pick up my phone, and pull up the number on the business card still sitting in my other hand. I remember the specific, small absurdity of the moment, standing in my own kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, comparing a business card to a text notification, feeling faintly ridiculous even as I did it. The way you feel ridiculous checking under the bed for something you're fairly sure isn't there. I typed the area code, the exchange, the last 4 digits. I stood there in my kitchen, card in one hand, phone in the other, looking at 2 numbers that were exactly, digit for digit, the same number. I checked it a second time, then a third, the way you double back over simple arithmetic when the answer is bad enough that you assume you must have made an error somewhere. Sarah's Pilates instructor and our marriage counselor were sharing a cell phone. Let me back up, because I don't think any of that makes sense without the year that came before it. Sarah and I had been married 6 years by the time we ended up in Warren Michaels' office, together 9. We'd had a good run for most of it. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would have flagged from the outside, just the specific, accumulating erosion that happens to a lot of marriages somewhere around year 5 or 6, when the versions of each other you fell in love with start competing with the versions you actually live with every day. We'd stopped really talking sometime the previous winter, not in any single moment I could point to, just a slow drift into 2 people who ran a household well together and knew almost nothing about what was actually going on inside the other one. I remember trying to pinpoint, in the early sessions, exactly when it had started, and never landing on a satisfying answer. Maybe it was the year her father got sick, and she spent every weekend 3 hours away at the hospital, coming home too depleted to talk about anything beyond logistics. Maybe it was just the ordinary compounding weight of 2 demanding jobs and a house that always seemed to need one more thing fixed before either of us had the bandwidth to fix us. I don't think there was a villain in that part of the story. I think there was just erosion, the kind that happens so gradually neither person notices until they're standing on a much smaller piece of ground than they started on, wondering how the tide got so far in without either of them hearing it come. It was Sarah who suggested counseling, in March, on a Tuesday night after we'd had one of those arguments that starts about the dishwasher and ends up being about everything except the dishwasher. She said she didn't want to keep living like roommates who occasionally slept in the same bed, and I remember being relieved to hear her say it, because I'd been feeling exactly the same thing and hadn't known how to bring it up without it sounding like an accusation. We found Warren Michaels through our friends Jenna and Paul, who'd done a round of counseling with him 2 years earlier after Paul's father died and the grief had turned their marriage into something neither of them recognized. Jenna talked about him the way people talk about a good doctor, warm, direct, actually useful, not just nodding and asking how that makes you feel. She gave us his card at a dinner party, actually, the same kind of card I'd find 8 weeks later sitting in my wallet meaning something completely different. I looked him up online before we booked the first appointment, the way I imagine most people do now, before handing a stranger access to the most fragile parts of their life. His reviews were uniformly glowing. 30-some testimonials on his practice's website, a solid 4.9 on the review sites. Phrases like, "changed our marriage," and "wish we'd found him years sooner," repeated often enough that I remember feeling genuinely reassured, the way you feel reassured booking a restaurant with good reviews before a big anniversary dinner. I didn't think, reading them, to wonder what a review from someone who'd had the exact opposite experience from Sarah and me might have looked like, or whether a woman in the middle of an active affair with her own marriage counselor would have been in any position to leave an honest one. His office was on the 3rd floor of a converted house near the hospital. Exposed brick, 2 leather chairs angled toward a slightly worn couch, a large window that let in good afternoon light, a small side table with a diffuser that always smelled faintly of eucalyptus. He was maybe 50, gray at the temples in the specific, photogenic way, warm handshake, the kind of calm, unhurried presence that made you feel like whatever you were about to say had been said in that room 100 times before, and none of it would shock him. At that first session, he had us each fill out an intake form, then spent most of the hour just listening, asking the occasional clarifying question, nodding in a way that felt genuinely attentive rather than performed. I remember feeling, walking out of that first hour, like we'd made a good decision, like this was a man who was actually going to help us, rather than just charge us to talk at each other in a nicer room than our own living room. Near the end, he handed us each a card, his personal cell, not the office line, and said the thing I'd forget almost entirely until it mattered. "A lot of the real work happens between sessions," he said. "If something comes up you want to process before we meet again, don't sit on it. Reach out. Either of you, separately is fine too." I remember thinking, at the time, that this was exactly the kind of accessible, modern approach that made him different from whatever stiff, formal image I'd had of therapy going in. I put the card in my wallet and didn't think about it again for 2 months. The first few sessions were, in the specific way these things go, both hard and quietly hopeful. Session 2, he had us do an exercise where we each had to name one thing the other person did that week that we appreciated and one thing that hurt. And Sarah cried when I said I appreciated her, out of nowhere, staying up late to help me practice a work presentation I was nervous about, a small thing I hadn't realized had landed as significantly as it apparently had. I remember driving home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Actual hope. The sense that we'd found the right person to help us find our way back to each other. Session 3, he gave us homework, 15 minutes a night, phones away, just talking, no agenda. We actually did it, most nights, and some of those 15-minute conversations turned into an hour. I want to be honest, that for the first month, I would have told anyone who asked that counseling was working, that Warren Michaels was worth every dollar, that Sarah and I were finding something back, that I'd worried, quietly, we'd lost for good. Session 4 was the one where Warren said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward, in the specific way a good therapist's line is supposed to. We'd been talking about how Sarah felt unseen at work, passed over for a promotion she'd quietly wanted, and Warren turned to her and said, "It sounds like you've gotten very good at being the person everyone else needs you to be, and not very practiced at saying what you actually want." She'd teared up at that, nodded slowly, said nobody had ever put it that way before. I remember feeling, in that moment, genuinely grateful to him, grateful that a stranger could see something in my wife that I'd apparently missed, and grateful that he was helping surface it instead of just letting it sit there unspoken between us for another 5 years. I think about that line differently now. At the time, it felt like insight. Later, it felt like the opening line of a pitch. It was somewhere around session 4 that I first noticed her on her phone during our appointments, and I want to be honest that I didn't think anything of it at the time. She'd glance down, thumb something quick, put it face down on her knee. I assumed it was work. She managed a dental office, and sometimes got messages from the front desk about scheduling conflicts, that genuinely couldn't wait. Warren never called her out on it, which struck me, in hindsight, as strange for a therapist who otherwise noticed everything, but at the time I read it as him simply being professional enough not to police her phone use in his own office. By session 5, it had become a real pattern. She was on her phone for what felt like a third of every session, sometimes more, always angling the screen slightly away from me, always putting it down the moment Warren addressed her directly, as if she'd developed a kind of radar for exactly when his attention was about to land on her. Session 5 was also the one where Warren gave us an assignment. I remember specifically because Sarah pushed back on it in a way that struck me as odd at the time, in a session otherwise defined by her going along with everything he suggested. He wanted us to plan a full weekend away, just the two of us, no phones after 6 p.m. either day. Sarah said, a little too quickly, that our schedules probably wouldn't line up for a few months given her work situation. Warren, instead of pushing the way he usually did when one of us hedged on an assignment, just nodded and said, "No rush, whenever it makes sense," and moved on to something else. I remember thinking, at the time, that he was just being flexible. I understand now that a full weekend away, with both of our phones off after 6, was probably the single assignment in that entire course of treatment he had the least interest in either of us actually completing. I brought it up once, gently, in the car after session 6. I said, "You were on your phone a lot in there today. Everything okay at work?" She said, "It's been a nightmare, honestly. We're migrating to a new scheduling system, and the front desk keeps texting me every time it breaks, which is constantly." I said, "Maybe mention it to Warren next time? Feels like it's eating into the actual session." She said, "It's fine. I'm still listening. I can do both." I let it go. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, delivered in a perfectly reasonable tone. And I want to be honest that some small, quiet part of me had already started keeping a mental tally by then, even though I hadn't admitted to myself yet what I was tallying toward. Session 7 was the one where something shifted, though I didn't understand what I was actually seeing until much later. We were 15 minutes in, working through an exercise about conflict patterns, when Warren excused himself, said he needed to grab something from his assistant's desk down the hall, and stepped out. He was gone almost 4 minutes, long enough that Sarah and I sat there in a slightly awkward silence, me flipping through my own notes, her, predictably, on her phone. I remember counting the seconds without meaning to, the way you do in a waiting room, and thinking it was a strange thing for a therapist to do mid-session, leave two people alone with an unfinished exercise between them. When he came back, he had a slight flush to him I registered at the time as nothing. Maybe he'd hurried down the stairs and back. Maybe the building's heat had kicked on too high. He apologized for the interruption, picked the exercise back up exactly where we'd left off, seamless enough that I didn't think about it again until much later. But I noticed, looking back, that Sarah's phone had gone from her knee to her purse sometime during those 4 minutes, tucked away for the rest of the session in a way it hadn't been for any of the previous 6. I only thought about those 4 minutes again 3 weeks later, once I understood what grabbing something from his assistant's desk had probably actually been. Session 8, the last one before I found the card in my wallet, ran long. He asked if we could go 15 minutes over because he wanted to finish a thought about attachment styles, and Sarah, who normally had a hard stop for the dental office by 6, said sure, she could stay. I remember being pleasantly surprised by that, reading it as her genuinely wanting to get more out of the work we were doing. I didn't think, not once, to ask myself why she'd suddenly become so flexible about a hard stop she'd mentioned in nearly every prior session. I remember the specific content of that extended 15 minutes too, which is its own strange thing to sit with now. Warren talking about anxious and avoidant attachment styles, how they tend to find each other and create exactly the kind of push-pull dynamic he said Sarah and I were caught in, drawing little diagrams on a legal pad to illustrate it. It was, on its own terms, genuinely interesting material, the kind of thing that made me feel, walking out of that office, like we were finally getting somewhere real. I've thought since about how strange it is that a man capable of explaining attachment wounds with that much clarity and compassion could, in the very same stretch of months, be causing an entirely new one in the room he was doing it in. That was Thursday. I found the card in my wallet the following Sunday. I didn't say anything to Sarah that afternoon. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after matching those two numbers, running through every innocent explanation I could construct, and finding, one at a time, that none of them held. A therapist doesn't typically share a personal cell number with his client's Pilates instructor. A Pilates instructor doesn't typically get client texts about bringing the thing we talked about at the same rhythm as a marriage counseling homework assignment. I sat with it through dinner, through the evening, through most of that night, not sleeping, running the 8 sessions back through my head in order, watching every piece rearrange itself into a shape I hadn't let myself see while it was happening. The phone in the office. The 4 minutes he was gone in session 7. The sudden flexibility about the hard stop in session 8. 8 sessions of my wife on her phone for a third of every hour, and a marriage counselor who never once, not a single time, asked her to put it away. I gave myself 2 weeks before I did anything, not because I doubted what I'd found, but because I wanted to understand the actual shape of it before I moved. I started, quietly, cross-referencing what I could. Sarah's calendar, still shared with me for scheduling reasons, showed a Pilates class every Tuesday at 6, a class I now called on a Tuesday afternoon while she was at work, using the studio's actual front desk number, asking to switch instructors because I'd heard great things about someone named Wendy. The woman on the phone, cheerful and unbothered, told me there'd never been a Wendy at that studio. There were 3 instructors on staff, and none of them went by that name. I remember standing in the parking lot of my own office building after that call, phone still warm against my ear, feeling something settle into place that I'd been circling for 2 weeks without letting myself land on. I checked our joint credit card statement next, going back to the week we started counseling, and found, tucked in among the ordinary charges, 4 separate transactions at a hotel about 20 minutes outside town, always on a Tuesday, always small enough, $30, $40, to read as a bar tab rather than a room, cross-referenced against her supposed Pilates schedule, every single one lined up, down to the day. I pulled up the hotel's website out of some morbid curiosity and found it was the kind of place with a bar attached. The sort of spot where a $30 charge could plausibly be 2 drinks and nothing more, which I think was probably the point, a number chosen specifically to survive a glance at a shared statement without raising anything. I also went back through my own memory of the sessions themselves, replaying them the way you replay a conversation looking for a joke you missed the first time, except every joke I found now looked like something else entirely. The number of times Warren had complimented Sarah's insight specifically, more than mine, in ways that had felt at the time like even-handed therapy, and now felt oddly personal. The number of times a session had run over at his suggestion, never mine. The fact that in 8 sessions, he'd never once given us an assignment that required us to be somewhere together outside the house. No date nights, no shared errands, nothing that would have used up a Tuesday evening that apparently already had other uses. By the end of that second week, I had a picture I didn't want and couldn't unsee. A marriage counselor, recommended to us in good faith by close friends, who had spent 8 sessions listening to my wife and me try to save our marriage, while apparently building an entirely separate relationship with her on the side, texting her mid-session under a fake contact name, disappearing for suspicious 4-minute stretches, keeping her late for the work, while I sat in the waiting room of my own trust, assuming the man across the desk was the one person in the building actually on my side. I told my brother that second week, the only person I told before any of it became official. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the hotel charges, the fake Pilates instructor, the matching phone number, and when I finished, he just sat there for a second and said, "Of all the people to do this to you, the actual marriage counselor," in a tone that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't far from one either, the specific, disbelieving reaction people have when something is too absurd to just be sad about yet. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I didn't fully know yet, only that whatever it wasn't going to be loud, and it wasn't going to happen in our kitchen. He didn't push me on what that meant, though I could tell he wanted to. He just told me to let him know if I needed anything, and meant it, which is more than I can say most people manage when they say that line. I want to explain the decision I made next, because I think it's the part of this story people either respect completely or think went too far, and I've made peace with both reactions. I didn't confront Sarah first. I didn't confront Warren Michaels first either. What I did, in the third week, was find the contact information for our state's board that licenses marriage and family therapists, and I filed a formal complaint, not an angry, undocumented rant, but a careful, dated account of what I'd observed and verified. The shared phone number, the fabricated Pilates instructor, the hotel charges lined up against a fictional class schedule, the pattern of unexplained absences and extended sessions. I attached copies of everything. I want to be honest that filing that complaint felt like the first genuinely calm thing I'd done in 3 weeks, because it took the whole mess out of the register of a marital fight and put it somewhere with actual rules, actual consequences, actual people whose job it was to care that a licensed professional had done exactly what every ethics code in his field explicitly forbids. I remember sitting at my laptop for almost an hour before I actually hit submit on that complaint form, not because I doubted the facts, but because some part of me understood that clicking that button was the moment this stopped being a private wound and became a permanent, documented record. The kind of thing that would exist in a file somewhere, regardless of what Sarah and I eventually decided to do about our marriage. I thought about calling my brother first, or a friend, someone to talk me through it. In the end, I didn't call anyone. It felt like the kind of decision that needed to be mine alone, made in the same quiet, methodical way I'd built the rest of the case, without anyone else's voice mixed into it. The board acknowledged the complaint within a few days and told me an investigator would be in touch, that these things typically took time, that I shouldn't take any additional action that might compromise the process. I told them I had one more session already on the books, the one Warren himself had suggested at the end of session 8, a check-in he'd framed as seeing how the homework's landing. I asked whether it would help or hurt their investigation if that session went ahead as scheduled. The investigator, a clipped, careful woman named Denise, told me it might actually help if I was comfortable with it, since a documented, witnessed interaction close to the timeline of the complaint could be useful. So I let the session stand. And 2 days before it, when the office sent its standard confirmation email, time, date, a reminder about cancellation policy, I hit reply all and added one more line above my confirmation and one more address in the CC field, Denise, at the licensing board, along with a short sentence noting that this session was being scheduled with the board's awareness as part of an active complaint regarding Dr. Michaels' conduct with a client. I sent it at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. I didn't hear back from the office. I assumed, correctly, as it turned out, that somebody had read it. Sarah didn't know any of it. That was deliberate. I wanted her walking into that room with exactly as much information as she'd had every other Thursday for the last 2 months, because I wanted to see, honestly, without warning, what she'd actually do once it was real. I drove to that final session with a kind of calm I didn't recognize in myself, a flat, procedural quiet that I imagine surgeons must feel, or pilots, people trained to do something enormous without letting their hands shake. Sarah talked in the car about a work thing, something about the new scheduling system finally getting fixed, and I nodded along in the right places, aware the entire time that I was having what was, unbeknownst to her, our last ordinary conversation. We arrived at 6. Warren's assistant, usually breezy and chatty at the front desk, was oddly quiet, wouldn't quite meet my eyes when she waved us back. I understood, walking down that hallway, that the email had landed exactly where I'd hoped it would. Warren was already seated when we came in, and I noticed immediately that something in him had changed since the previous week. A stiffness in his shoulders, a smile that didn't quite reach the rest of his face, the particular over-preparedness of a man who spent the last 2 days rehearsing a version of calm he doesn't actually feel. He said, "Good to see you both. How's the week been?" I said, "Eventful, actually. I wanted this session to be about something specific, if that's all right." Sarah shot me a look, surprised, not yet alarmed, the look of someone who thinks their spouse is about to bring up something small, an argument from Tuesday, a complaint about chores. I said, "I found your card in my wallet a few weeks ago, Warren, the one you gave us at our first session. I noticed the number on it matched a contact saved in my wife's phone under a name that doesn't actually exist at her Pilates studio." The room went very still. Sarah's face drained of color in a way I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not the flush of anger, the specific gray of someone realizing, all at once, that the ground she's been standing on isn't there anymore. She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I'm talking about Wendy, Sarah. I'm talking about 4 hotel charges on our joint card, all on Tuesdays, all lined up with a Pilates class that doesn't have an instructor by that name. I'm talking about 8 sessions where you were on your phone constantly and Warren never once asked you to put it away, which I used to think was professionalism and now understand was just convenience." Warren said, in a voice working very hard to sound measured, "I think we should slow down here. This is a serious accusation, and I'd want to understand." I said, "You don't need to understand anything, Warren. The state board already does. I filed a complaint 3 weeks ago. They're the ones who suggested this session go forward, actually, once I told them it was already scheduled. You'll notice the confirmation email you got Tuesday had an extra name on it. I imagine you noticed. I imagine that's why you look like you haven't slept, and why your assistant couldn't look either of us in the eye on the way in." Warren's jaw tightened. He said, "Whatever you think you've pieced together." I said, "I don't think, Warren. I have 4 hotel charges, a fabricated Pilates instructor, and a business card with your personal cell number on it that matches a contact my wife has saved under a fake name. I'm not here to argue the facts with you. I'm here to watch you sit with them." I watched something in him collapse in real time, not dramatically, no shouting, no denial dressed up as outrage. He just went quiet, the specific quiet of a man doing rapid math on how much of his life is currently in the process of ending. His hands, I noticed, had gone still on the arms of his chair, in a way they hadn't been at the start of the session, when he'd been tapping a pen against his knee the whole time we made small talk. Sarah said, "You can't, this isn't," and then stopped, because there wasn't an ending to that sentence that made any of it better. I said, "I'm not here to fight with either of you tonight. I'm here because Denise from the licensing board asked me to let this session happen naturally, as documentation, so feel free to talk. I'll wait." Nobody talked for a long time after that. Sarah eventually said, in a small voice I'd never heard from her before, "It wasn't supposed to happen. He understood things about what I was feeling that I didn't even know how to say to you." I said, "He's a licensed professional whose entire job was to help you learn to say those things to me. Instead, he used them to get you into a hotel room 20 minutes outside town. I don't think that's understanding, Sarah. I think that's a very specific kind of predatory, and I think some part of you already knows that, or you wouldn't have looked like you'd seen a ghost the second I said his name out loud in this room." Warren said, quietly, "I'd like to end the session here." I said, "I bet you would. Denise will be in touch with you separately, I imagine. I just wanted you both to hear, in the same room, exactly how much I knew, and exactly how long I've known it." I stood up and left. I didn't wait for either of them to say anything else. There wasn't anything left that either of them could have said that would have mattered to me by that point. I sat in my car in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes afterward, not driving anywhere, just sitting with the engine off, watching the lit window of the third-floor office from below, wondering what was actually happening up there between the two of them now that I'd left them alone with it. I never found out, and I've decided I don't especially want to. Whatever conversation happened in that room after I walked out belonged to the two of them, the first and only thing left in that entire situation that still did. I want to tell you the story ended cleanly right there, with me walking out of that office and some tidy, satisfying justice landing exactly where it belonged. It took longer than that, and it landed harder than I expected, on more people than just the two of them. The board's investigation took 4 months. Denise called me twice during that stretch, once to confirm a few details, once, near the end, to tell me something I hadn't anticipated. Warren Michaels wasn't a first-time offender. 2 other former clients, women who'd come to him, like Sarah, for marriage counseling, had come forward once word of the investigation started circulating in the small, tightly networked world of local therapists, describing a strikingly similar pattern: the late sessions, the personal cell number handed out at the first appointment, the processing between sessions language he apparently used, nearly word for word, with all of them. I remember sitting with that phone call for a long time after Denise hung up, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication exactly, more a kind of grim, exhausted confirmation that the specific horror of what had happened to my marriage wasn't even original to me. He'd run some version of this same script at least twice before, on 2 other couples who'd walked into that office with exactly the same hope Sarah and I had walked in with 8 months earlier, trusting a stranger with the worst, most vulnerable parts of a failing marriage. I thought about Jenna and Paul, who'd recommended him to us in good faith, and wondered, uncomfortably, whether their own round of counseling with him years earlier had been as clean as it had always seemed, though I never worked up the nerve to ask. He lost his license within the year, not suspended, revoked outright, the board's public disciplinary record listing multiple violations of the prohibition against sexual or romantic relationships with current clients, in language dry enough to undersell exactly how much damage it described. His practice closed within weeks of the ruling becoming public, the website taken down, the office on the 3rd floor eventually leased to what I later heard was an orthodontist. A local news outlet picked up the story once the board's decision went on record, and for about 2 weeks that spring, local marriage counselor and multiple clients were phrases you could find without much effort if you searched his name, which I'll admit, I did more than once, not entirely proud of how much satisfaction it gave me. I heard, secondhand, that he tried to set up a private life coaching practice under a different name later that year, unlicensed, unregulated, and that it folded within a few months once word got around in the same small town where everyone had already heard exactly why he wasn't allowed to call himself a therapist anymore. Sarah and I divorced within 6 months of that final session. There wasn't much left to fight over. No kids, a house we sold and split evenly, a decision that turned out to be far less complicated than the marriage itself had been in its last year. There was one moment during mediation, dividing up furniture neither of us particularly wanted, when she asked, out of nowhere, whether I'd done all of it. The complaint, the CC, the ambush in that final session, to punish her or to protect the next couple who might have walked into that office. I told her the honest answer was probably both, in proportions I hadn't fully worked out myself, and that I didn't think either reason canceled the other one out. She didn't have much to say back to that. She moved 2 states away not long after, for what she described to mutual friends as a fresh start, though I've never been entirely sure how far away you actually have to move to get one of those. I heard, through the same loose network that tells you everything eventually, that she didn't stay in touch with Warren after the investigation started, that whatever they'd had apparently didn't survive contact with actual consequences any better than my marriage had survived contact with the truth. I think about that final session more than almost anything else. Not the fury of it, which faded faster than I expected, but the specific, procedural calm I felt the whole way through. The sense that I wasn't destroying anything so much as simply making visible a thing that had already destroyed itself months earlier. The moment a man whose entire job was protecting the trust between 2 people decided his own wants mattered more than either half of it. I still see Warren Michaels' name occasionally, mostly by accident. A mention in a local business forum where someone once asked, months after the story broke, whether anyone knew what had actually happened to that counselor, and got answers ranging from wildly inaccurate rumor to a few people who clearly had the real details and simply didn't want to be the one to spell them out publicly. I've never corrected the record myself. I don't feel any particular need to. The board's own public filing says everything that needs saying. In the dry, unglamorous language these things always get written in, and I've found that dry and unglamorous suits the truth of it better than anything I could add. I don't feel guilty about the licensing board complaint, or the CC on that email, or the silence I let sit in that room before either of them found anything to say. I've heard people describe moves like that as brutal, and I don't disagree. I just think some things earn exactly that. A man spent 8 sessions taking a fee to help repair a marriage while quietly ending it from the inside, and I don't think there's a soft version of consequence that actually fits a thing like that. I think brutal, in that particular case, was just the accurate word for what was owed. I've thought, since, about all the couples who never find out, who spend a year or 2 sessions a month with someone like Warren Michaels, trusting him completely, and simply never happen to leave their card in a wallet at the right moment, or notice a name on a screen that doesn't quite add up. I don't know how many of those there are. I don't know how many marriages ended for reasons the people inside them never actually understood. I only know I happened to be the one who did, and once I wasn't interested in being gentle about what I did with it. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with realizing the person you trusted to fix something was actually the one breaking it further, and I don't think I've fully worked through what that did to how I trust anyone now, professionals especially. I still went to individual therapy afterward, with someone else entirely, a woman recommended by my own doctor, rather than by any friend who might have had a reason to already know her personally. I remember sitting in her office for the first session, saying almost nothing, just watching her, waiting to see if she was going to be the kind of person who noticed everything except the one thing that mattered. As far as I can tell, she wasn't. That's about as much trust as I've been able to rebuild in that particular direction, and I've decided it's enough. If you've ever paid someone to help you and later found out they were the one hurting you, drop your thoughts in the comments below.